Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back, and welcome to the afternoon session of the 13th World Coffee Leaders Forum. This morning, we had very insightful keynote speeches, and also our moderator asked questions and share the idea and insight. Thank you. And we'd like to remind those who didn't attend this morning session, this year, for more enriching and professional sessions, a moderator will be leading the presentations and discussions. Professor Shahan Yeretian, a professor of analytical chemistry and head of Coffee Excellence Center in Zurich University of Applied Sciences, will be our moderator. So, ladies and gentlemen, would you please give him a big round of applause?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome, people coming back also now from lunch. And so we'd like to continue with our forum. And this afternoon, I have the honor to introduce two, I would call, iconic people in their business. First of all, James, who is now since 10 years the CEO of one of the most traditional and iconic specialty roastery of the world, a US company, Intelligentsia. It's really a brand that everybody knows in our community. I'm very happy that he will be here together with Luiz, Paulo, who is, I call him a farmer. I don't know whether he likes that word, but he's an exceptional farmer. And they have been working together as a team and brought all these fantastic coffees that we see today. So I'd like to welcome on the stage today James and Luiz, and I'm curious to hear about specialty and varieties. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. It's nice to see you. Luiz, Paulo, and I are delighted to be here to talk about one of our favorite topics, which is the importance of plant diversity. The kind of genesis of this talk is that plant diversity is fundamentally critical for us to thrive as an industry and also to push consumers further along in their coffee journey. We heard this morning from Pauline, and I think she actually did a lot of the work for me, which I'm pretty happy about, setting up this idea of experiences and the importance of them. To kick things off, just a little bit about Intelligentsia. We were started in 1995. We're based in the US, in Chicago. Earlier this year, we had the privilege of opening our first coffee bars here in Korea. So we now have 3 coffee bars here in Seoul, and we're really excited about being part of this amazing community here. At Intelligentsia, we talk about this a lot. We believe that coffee is culinary. And when you think about the value that you get when you go into a coffee bar and you pay $8 for a black cup of coffee, it's truly phenomenal. There is no other experience where you get that kind of value out of this amazing experience, from the beautiful setting to a professionally trained barista to working with amazing partners like Luiz, Paulo. And so what we talk about and what we do each and every day is try to push coffee further along this journey towards culinary. So that's the vision. Everything that we do at Intelligentsia ladders up to that vision. And that is the spaces themselves. They have to be beautifully designed. We want consumers to walk into a coffee bar, an Intelligentsia coffee bar, and say, gosh, there's something different about this experience. And I don't know what it is yet, but just walking through the door, I know just based on the beautiful space here that something's different, something is amazing. Baristas, they're fundamental in what we do. They have to be world-class to fully execute on our vision of culinary. Every single coffee that goes across the bar has to be perfectly dialed in and look perfect. One of the things that we do at our coffee bars is we have a menu that we print each and every day. And why do we do that? Well, that's because we want consumers to realize that coffee is not just coffee. There's coffee from different countries. There's coffee from different farms. There's coffee that have been processed differently. And one way to communicate that to consumers is to have a menu that gets printed each and every day. The other thing that's really important to us at Intelligentsia is roasting the coffee light. Light, medium, dark. We believe that to present coffee as culinary, we need to showcase the terroir of the land and the work of the farmer. And so the only way to do that is to roast the coffee fairly lightly and not apply a heavy hand from the roaster. And so when you pull all these things together, that's when you can start to work towards coffee as culinary. But none of that matters if the ingredient itself is not extraordinary. We can have beautiful coffee bars, world-class baristas, interesting menus, interesting drinks. If the raw material, the ingredient, the green coffee is not perfect, none of that matters. And this is what we're going to talk about today, plants, because obviously coffee comes from plants. So how does Intelligentsia ensure that our ingredient is extraordinary? The first thing that we do is we work closely with all of our farmers. And so farmers like Luiz, Paulo, a lot of the farmers here in this photo, we have direct connections to them. And if you step back to where we were when we first started the company, that wasn't how we did things. We, like a lot of other companies, would call up an importer and say, hey, I need 20 bags for my house blend. And the importer would look at whatever they had in inventory at the time, and they'd send us the 20 bags. That is not a recipe for pushing coffee towards culinary. And so we started working directly with farmers. We started going down and traveling to origin. And we realized that farmers hold so many of the keys towards extraordinary coffee. The other thing that's really, really important to Intelligentsia and that I think allows us to create a culinary experience is having long-term relationships with farmers. Why does that matter? If you think about how coffee was traditionally traded, it was a farmer would sell coffee to a local middleman who would sell coffee to an exporter who would sell coffee to an importer. And it was a very transactional relationship. That all changes when we have farmers who know for upwards of 20 years that we are going to be doing business together each and every year. It doesn't matter if the harvest is big or small, if the quality is good or bad. They know that Intelligentsia is going to be there to buy coffee. Why is that important for farmers? Because that changes the mindset of farmers. Suddenly they know with pretty good predictive abilities what the prices they're going to get paid, how much we're going to buy, and that allows them to invest in their farms, in their businesses, the way most of us do here in consuming countries. The other thing that we do is we go down and we visit farmers every year. And why do we do that? We typically do it during the harvest because what we've learned is that is the most important time for producing high-quality coffee. So it allows us to have conversations and dialogues with the farmers about what's happening on the farm, what's happening with a rainfall perspective, how the cherries are being picked, processed, and all that stuff. We also host what we call as our Extraordinary Coffee Workshop, where we bring all of our farmers together once a year, and we do different workshops. We've held it in Ethiopia, we've held it in Brazil, we've held it in Guatemala, we've held it in Chicago, and it's an opportunity for all these different farmers to learn from each other, and we put on seminars about quality. So if our farmers are learning how to produce higher quality coffee from each other, that obviously benefits Intelligentsia because all the coffee quality is going to increase. The other thing that we do is we create a connection between the farmers and the end consumer. And one of the things that we believe is very, very important for a successful relationship is to create a feedback mechanism between the farmers and us as roasters, and to the extent we can as consumers. And that takes the form of many different things, but the clearest example of that is we provide information back to the farmer on every single lot of coffee that they send us. And it's cupping reports, it's how the coffee performed over time. And what does that allow the farmer to do? Well, the farmer could then go back to their farm and say, that's really interesting. Lot 1, 2, 3 was dried this way versus lot 3, 4, 5, and that created a different sensory experience in the lot. It lasted longer. There could be a myriad number of outcomes. But it's that feedback loop that's really, really important, and I think fairly unique for our relationships with farmers. So we've been doing direct trade for close to 20 years, and during that time we've learned a lot, as you can probably imagine. And what we talk about today at Intelligentsia is the factors that affect quality at the farm can be grouped into 3 different kind of big buckets: genetics, environment, and management. If we start with management, these are things that the farmer can control 100%. This is 100% within their control. The farmer has choices about how ripe they're going to pick coffee cherries. The farmer has choices about how many passes they're going to make through their farm to collect cherries. The farmer has choices about how they're going to process coffees, the fertilizer they're going to use. These are all choices that the farmer makes. And what we like to tell farmers is that when you're working with a company like Intelligentsia, the beauty is you know what prices you're going to get paid, so you can decide the level of effort you want to put into it to produce a higher quality coffee. The second big bucket is environment, and this refers to what you would expect. This is mainly stuff that the farmer has no control over. The rainfall in a given year, the location of their farm, whether it's located at 3,000 meters above sea level or 1,500 meters above sea level, whether the farm gets sun in the morning or sun in the afternoon. These are largely factors that are outside of the farmer's control. And then the third one is genetics. And this really isn't something that we've talked about until recently. And this relates to, obviously, what we're going to talk about today, and that's the plants that the farmer chooses to put in the ground. So when you take all these things together, and there are myriad factors that go into the genetics, environment, and management bucket, if the farmers do a lot of things right, then they're going to produce extraordinary coffee. And one of the things that you'll hear our lab talk about at Intelligentsia is that the quality ceiling is reached at the farm. So what does that mean? It means that once the farmer is done producing that green coffee, there really is nothing that Intelligentsia can do to make that coffee taste better. I can only do things that are going to make it taste worse. So the farmers really hold all the keys to the quality, producing quality coffee. And that's why the direct trade relationships that we have with farmers is so important. But getting back to the genetics conversation, rather than have a roaster talk about genetics and what it means and why it's important, I thought it would be much more interesting to partner up with Luiz Paulo, who, as you have heard, we've been working with for many, many, many years. I've known Luiz Paulo for 12 years. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about what genetics mean for him at the farm level. And I will say, just a preview, I think what Luiz Paulo is doing with genetics is probably cutting edge. Not probably, it is cutting edge, and it's at the leading end of the spectrum. And I think this is where farmers are going to have to go in this direction to be successful.
How can I open this?
Yep.
Thanks so much, James. For me, it's an honor to be here to explain a little bit what we are doing in Brazil. But first, I want to say thanks so much for Intelligentsia to be part of our coffee history, because Intelligentsia is totally responsible for our genetic garden at our farm. I will explain a little bit about how we improve and how we are doing the coffee garden in Carmo. Explain a little bit about my history. I'm in the 4th generation working with coffee. I started to look for specialty coffee in 2002, and then we start our history with Intelligentsia in 2006. All my family in the past, we were only looking for commodity. All the Brazilian coffees, the people say, no, Brazil produce only quantity, and I was afraid because the idea is how to change and how to move Brazil for a different level of coffee production. And as you can see here, we are located in Carmo de Minas. Carmo de Minas is located in Minas Gerais state, in the south of Minas. Our altitude is around 1,100 meters to 1,500 meters. But what we saw in the past, we are trying to produce a good coffees, but with exactly the traditional varietals, comparing to the varietals like Geisha, Romé Sudan, was difficult to say, okay, we have a good coffees in Brazil. And then we start a program with ECW, where we start to work with Intelligentsia 18 years ago. But at 12 years, if I'm not wrong, we had the first ECW in Colombia. And then we start to compare the coffees and understand about the terroir, understand about process. And then our decision was, okay, we have a good place, but we don't have the same process, and then we don't have the same varietals. How can we put Brazil in the same level without these topics? With the ECW, where here you can see in different countries, we were visiting Ethiopia, Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Bolivia, and all these places. My question was, what's the best varietal you have here? And then James was helping me to collect some seeds, and then I can say we have probably nowadays 32 different varietals coming from this place where the people thought that was the best varietal. Some varietals works well in Brazil, but some varietals doesn't work. But we keep the varietal there just to say, okay, we have the varietal here, because all the varietals is in our farm is planted exactly at the same place, and they receive the same water, the same fertilization, because we want to compare why the varietal produce different, what kind of process we can make a good coffee. And this helps us a lot to understand what kind of varietal can adapt in Brazil. And nowadays, as you can see here, we can exchange idea with friends. I have some Colombian friends here, Jairo, who helped me a lot to understand more about coffee process. But for us, as a Brazilian producer, without this help, was impossible to say, okay, I can put Brazil in a different level of coffee production. Because nowadays, unfortunately, the majority of the producers in Brazil is still looking only for quantity, not quality. But in my idea, as we are located in a mountains area, if we don't produce a good coffees, it's impossible to keep producing coffee in our areas. And nowadays, for a big surprise to the world, we have a very nice geisha project, probably one of those the biggest geisha plantation in the world. Now we have 100 hectares of geisha, and these geishas, we select a very nice seeds who came from Panama. We have geisha from Honduras, geisha from Colombia, and geisha from Costa Rica. But the majority of our geishas who adapted well in Brazil is the green tea from Panama. We have more varietals in Brazil, like Laurina, Romé Sudan, who is getting in day after day producing better in Brazil. But for our surprise, the coffee who is producing very well in Brazil is the geisha. But the idea with our geisha, we don't want to compete with Panama or other countries to say, okay, we have exactly the same geisha. No, we are building to have a Brazilian geisha with a profile totally different comparing to the other countries. And then, now I think the best person to say more about what we are doing and then where we are with the new process in Brazil is our friend, Mr. James, who can explain the result about all this job we did with the ECW and Intelligentsia.
Well, so before, this is an example of what we can do when we have farmers that are doing cutting-edge work, right? We as a roaster have the ability to push the boundaries on what people are expecting from a cup of coffee, and one way to do that is to lean into what Luiz Paulo is doing. We can talk about the Panama geisha seeds. We can talk about the land where he's planted the Mantiqueira Mountains of Minas. And then we talk about the processing, the anaerobic fermentation, the fact that he dried the coffee in a blue house. So when we have deep partnerships like Intelligentsia does with Luiz Paulo, this is what we're able to bring to consumers in the US and now Korea. So I think what Luiz Paulo is doing is really cutting edge. There's really no farm that I'm aware of where you can go and you can walk 100 hectares and see 32 different coffee varieties. There's nowhere else in the world that I'm aware of where you can do that. It's really one of the most magical experiences as someone who likes coffee, to get to go down there and see all these different tree structures and how the coffee is reacting. And I think what Luiz Paulo is doing today is about as much as we can expect from farmers, given, frankly, the lack of investment that we've made as an industry in genetic diversity. But what I also want to talk about is this really exciting new chapter, which is the work that WCR, World Coffee Research, is doing. And you all heard from Dr. Vern Long, who leads up the organization this morning. But I want to talk a little bit more about it. So you heard about WCR. It's an industry-funded group. We have 190 members all over the world. And WCR, this is all they do. They focus on the coffee tree. This is it. That's all there is. And it's really the first time in our young industry's existence that we've had an organization full of scientists who are working on nothing but the coffee plant. How do we make it better, and how do we improve it for farmers? So this is stunning, or it should be. So there are 6,640 varieties of strawberries that have been registered with UPOV. Coffee has 111 varieties. What this means is there's 59 times more innovation happening in strawberries than in coffee. And that doesn't make any sense. We as an industry have underinvested in this space, and we're seeing the effects of that underinvestment today in farms around the world. This obviously is leaf rust, for those of you that have seen it. It's a spore that attaches to the bottom of leaves, and it kills the leaf. And eventually, if there's enough leaf rust in the air, the whole tree will lose all its leaves, and obviously a tree can't survive if it doesn't have leaves. This leaf rust, we obviously had the epidemic in Central America about 10 years ago, and it devastated farmers all over Central America. And one of the reasons was because the variety of coffee that we have planted are not disease resistant. The other thing that's happening, and you heard our speakers talk about it this morning, is climate. Climate change is happening. It's here. It's real. We're seeing farms, there's higher temperatures, there's more drought, there's more intense rainfalls, the environment is changing. And as a result, you have some scientists here who have predicted what coffee growing is going to look like in 2050. And you can see all the red on the screen. I know it's probably hard to see in the back. Those are areas that are producing coffee today that are going to be less inviting an environment for coffee production in the future. So we need to catch up as an industry with what's happening with the climate if we want to continue to drink coffee. And I for one, do. So that's where the work of World Coffee Research is going to help us, and it's going to help us also drive things forward. These are the 111 varieties that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to dumb down what WCR is doing because the stuff that they're doing is really, really complicated. But what the scientists at World Coffee Research have done is they've collected all the varieties that exist in the world, they've centralized it, and now they're creating super varieties. That's my term, not a scientific term. And so the scientists for the last 10 years have been analyzing the varieties, understanding what they're doing, and recently have done 5,000 crosses of 16 of the best varieties. And those new crosses, the winners, basically, because they're choosing which plants win and lose, and they're evaluating them against a criteria for yield. We obviously want more coffee. Farmers need to be able to produce more coffee on the same amount of land. We want coffee plants that are resistant to disease. And most important for me is I want them to be extraordinary. I want them to be stunning in the cup. And so when they did the 5,000 crosses, they came up with 100 varieties that will be released in 2030. So I'm going to repeat that again because it's something that's really, really, really exciting. We have 111 varieties today. In 6 years, World Coffee Research is going to be releasing 100 new Arabica varieties. That's really, really exciting when you think about the potential for what that is going to do for our industry and for farmers in terms of these three attributes. So all of this is really interesting and exciting, but I think for many of you in the room, it's, well, how does this impact coffee drinkers? Why is this important for coffee drinkers? The first thing that I want to say is that Pauline mentioned this. We're a relatively young industry, and we have moved pretty far from a purely commodity industry to something that is much more specialty and culinary focused. And there was a point in time when people just understood that there was coffee. And then people started to understand that coffee could taste different if it's roasted differently. And then we started talking about origin and how origins are different. And now we're talking about single origins. We want a single place. This coffee is from this single place. When we start talking about plant genetics with consumers, we're getting more special. We're getting more specialized. And the more specialized we get, the more value that the consumers are going to place on it, which has the benefit, as Pauline explained to us this morning, of creating more value for everybody in the industry. The other thing that's really important is that it ties back into how we present coffees and what we can talk about with consumers. When we have many, many different varieties, we have the ability to create new experiences for consumers. Coffee is a ritual. It is something that people like to do. It's not just a beverage. And when we have an experience, when we can present many different varieties to our customers, it creates new experiences and new choices. Consumers have to make choices about what varieties they want because we have multiple different varieties. And when consumers have to make choices, they generally tend to get educated. And the more educated the consumer is, generally the more sticky they are. They stay loyal to your brand. All of this, the experiences and the choices, create consumers' preferences. And the more we can create more consumers can identify what they prefer, whether it's the geisha from Luiz Paulo's farm or the coffee from Jairo's farm in Colombia. That benefits us, it creates value, and it gets us closer to this idea of coffee being culinary. This is what Intelligentsia does today on a very small scale. When we can identify really extraordinary lots, we will talk to consumers about interesting processing techniques, whether it's Mosto or anaerobic, whether it's anaerobic, whether it's natural. We talk about consumers, we are presenting consumers with choices about varietals or specific origins. And these are coffees that I can tell you sell very, very fast, which to me is a very good indicator that there is demand for this, and we have the opportunity with more varieties coming out to do this on a much, much larger scale. So you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to believe anything I'm saying, because there's many, many examples of other agricultural products doing this in the marketplace. And I'm going to do something that I probably shouldn't do. I'm going to try to pronounce the Korean word for grapes. This is obviously the podu, 2 examples of it. And these two grapes were developed in the grape on the purple grape was developed in the 1930s. And it was a step change in terms of what the product developed, what the grape delivered to customers, and customers paid a higher price. The grape on the right is it's a much newer grape. It was developed in the 1980s, late 80s, and it's the Chine Muscat. And for those of you that have tried it, this grape costs 10 times as much as a traditional table grape. The flavor profile that it delivers is unique. There's a interesting winey floral note. It's incredibly sweet. The skin is incredibly thin, so it's easy to enjoy. And this is an excellent example of what we have the potential to do with coffee. We have the opportunity to get closer to this with new varietal development, leaning into coffee varieties, and making customers more excited about what we're doing. So, standing here today, I think that we are closer than ever to fully realizing this statement with a wide swath of the general public. It's not just the Intelligentsia customers who are going to get this, but with the work that's happening with farmers like Luiz Paulo, with the farmers like Jairo, with the organizations like World Coffee Research, we have the opportunity to get them much closer to understanding that coffee truly is culinary and valuing it that way. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Luiz. And I'd like to just to kickstart. You have put the focus really on the craft, really mastering the product. Then let me ask a question. How much do you believe the brand is so important? For me, the brand, it's the logo is fantastic, the brand is fantastic. How much do you believe that the brand is also part of the success of Intelligentsia, irrespective of the product?
I think brand is important, but I think as Pauline explained this morning, there's a lot of things that go into creating a brand. And so I think brands today serve the function of sort of the lack of understanding about coffee, genetics, processing, everything else. Because consumers can create an association with a brand. I trust Intelligentsia. The coffee I'm going to get from Intelligentsia is going to deliver, whether it's the coffee from Luiz Paulo or Jairo or Ethiopian coffee, whatever it is. I understand that they will put it through a certain rigorous screening process and they're going to deliver something consistent. So I think brands are important because they create experiences, they create a feeling about coffee that you wouldn't get from just an unbranded product. But I also think that brands are important today because consumers don't understand a lot about coffee. So we serve as the sort of gatekeeper on what goes into our bags.
Yeah, exactly. I think it is a catalytic effect on what you deliver on the quality side. And the brand, it allows that. It's a match between the craft and the brand in the case of Intelligentsia that just really works so nicely together to make really craft also get the traction in the market. And I think that's what I believe is so unique at Intelligentsia, is that both are kind of coming together, And in a way, it is the traditional way of doing coffee, but you are kind of the god of keeping the things like we always learn doing really good and continue. I'd like to ask Luiz something. Luiz, you have all these huge varieties. And again, a little bit the same type of question. How much do you believe the variety is important? How much is the love to the plant, to the farm, is all the care given important in the final results of what you achieve with your plants?
Nowadays, we can say who varietal represent like 60% of the final profile. We have in our place 32 different varietals, and then we can see how the varietals they are cupping different. Comparing to the traditional varietals in Brazil, sometimes we have 3, 4, 5 points scoring higher than the traditional Acaiá in Brazil. And they are cultivated at the same place, receiving the same water, the same fertilization. The question is, why they are cupping different? The unique reason is because the varietal has potential to improve the profile at the end. In our opinion, varietals nowadays represent 60% of the final cupping.
Mm-hmm. I see. Before I give to the audience, one more question to you. You have really squeezed out everywhere where we can, where human can do things to improve the quality. where do you believe is still a big margin to make like a leap, like a major change in quality in the future? Is there something left?
Yes, I think the second step, because when we start with ACW, the idea to change the varietals and improve the varietals in Brazil, and now we understand for the second step, we need to understand better about the coffee process. How to improve the profile to achieve the high levels, like 90 something, we need to understand more about the process. Anaerobic fermentations, anaerobic maceration, whatever, but we need to understand and respect in each varietal what kind of process they adapt. Because some varietals, they don't accept anaerobic fermentation, but some varietals, they develop it well doing washed or natural. I think, in my opinion, the challenge now is understand what kind of process will match for a specific varietal.
I just want to jump in on this. So I think we're in the very, 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 very early stages of coffee and what the potential is in terms of the quality and everything else. There's a ton of stuff happening at the farms. We have World Coffee Research doing varieties now. We have UC Davis that's doing work on post-harvest processing. But there's also a ton of work going on extraction, with roasting. Like, there's so many different areas of coffee, like little segments, parts that ultimately make up the coffee, the cup of coffee that we enjoy, that there's tons of innovation happening, and we're still early days. I mean, I've thought about this a lot with wine, and Pauline used 5,000 years of wine versus not that 500 years of coffee. Like, we're an infant industry that hasn't invested in sort of research and having people like you that are doing real scientific work to understand how these different things that we do. I think you started the program off with this idea that we started the industry as this passion, like it was this passion project, and there was so much love for it, and I think that's true, and what we're doing now is we're catching up on the hard research side to really unlock what is truly possible with coffee. And so I personally think that we're really just starting to scratch the surface on what an extraordinary cup of coffee could be.
Yeah. So I'd like to open now to the audience also for questions from your end. Profit. Intelligentsia is now opening up shops here, or really you can enjoy it here now locally. So, yeah. Please.
You asked it about...
Just microphone, just a second. Somebody bring microphone.
It's because you asked how the variety can change the quality, and we talked about the roasting and the processing, and about terroir. How do you think the terroir can affect the punctuation and the quality that you want? How much? For you too.
For you too. I think the terroir is very important. Of course, when we say we are trying to improve and using different varietals, we understand who we are having a good terroir, in our case located in Carmo de Minas. But even with the good terroir, we can improve our profile using the best varietals with the correct process. But I think James can talk more about some different countries.
Yeah, I think that terroir is sort of an under-leveraged aspect of like where we can go with coffee. Like we're definitely not as far along as wine is in terms of we understand that this region of France can produce this grape and it'll taste this way. And we as a consumer know that. In coffee, we don't have that. We don't know what the geisha from Carmo de Minas is going to taste like versus the geisha from Honduras. I would say that if you think back to that genetics, environment, and management, your question is an excellent one because it is the environment piece. And we're still trying to understand why geisha from Bolivia tastes different than geisha from Honduras, that's different from geisha from Panama. And it can literally be the exact same seed that will taste very different in the cup. And the obvious answer is the environment is different. It's the different soil types, it's the rainfall, everything else. So I think what we've we're starting to try to unlock, and it's one of the reasons that I think Luiz Paulo planted 25 different varieties, is I don't know what's going to work, and nobody really does. There's no group in the world today that can say if you plant this variety in this type of soil condition and it receives this kind of rain and everything else, you're going to get this in the cup. So it's an exciting time. It's a frustrating time because farmers don't know. But I think it also is one of the reasons to be excited about what's to learn in coffee.
Yes. I personally believe that coffee is respecting terroir more than wine. We are really, we're not changing the terroir, you know, we don't have barrels that are toasted, we don't add acid. We really work with the coffee, but we roast it. So terroir is a fantastic subject to think about, but beyond that, any other questions? Otherwise, let me, but is there? Yeah, I hope there is one.
Thank you for sharing your insight. I have a question to CEO of Intelligentsia. So you really said a lot importance about the supply chain, the upstream side, but in a market like in South Korea where the market trends change really fast, like your work takes a long time to deliver to the customers. So how does Intelligentsia try to like react to those fast changing trends? Do you have like any way to like balance between the long-term goal and between the like customer's taste?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the trends definitely change here very, very fast. I would say that everything we do has a North Star, and it's really what I started with, which is our belief that coffee can be culinary. And so if we're going to respond to a trend or try to create a trend, it needs to align with that ultimate goal. And if it doesn't, then it's not right for us, it's right for some other brand or 10 other brands. But that really is kind of our North Star, and everything that we do at the company, all the decisions that we make are really passed through that lens to decide whether it's right for us or it's right for another company. So I would say that's how we make our decisions, but yeah, we're always trying to innovate and stay relevant in what is a rapidly changing part of the industry.
Thank you so much.
Some other question? We still have 1-2 more minutes, I think.
You talk about coffee being culinary, and one of the ways that wine is culinary is that we're seeing it in top-end restaurants on a regular basis, and we have sommeliers who talk about it with great detail and knowledge, and that's where most of our relationship with wine comes from. How do you see coffee can get in that same position where we can have the restaurant team talking eloquently about our product? It's something I think we've really struggled with. Do you have any ideas on how we get into that space?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's one of my biggest frustrations, right? Like, you go out to an amazing restaurant, you spend all this money on just an amazing meal, every detail is thoughtfully considered, and then literally the last thing you get is the cup of coffee as you leave, and the level of care often isn't there quite yet. I think that it's an ongoing conversation that we just have to have, and I think we have found some partners in the U.S. who have been interested and invested in learning and training their staff. At Intelligentsia, we have a position called the educator, and it is the equivalent of a wine sommelier, somebody who can speak fluently about all the work that we're doing at Origin, can speak fluently about what we do on roasting and extraction and brewing. And so I think we're trying to create that type of a position, the wine sommelier position. But what we have to do as an industry is get consumers to value coffee more. $6, $7 is not enough, given the amount of work that Luiz Paulo does, that Intelligentsia does, the baristas do, the restaurants do. Consumers have to understand that what they're getting today is an incredible value, and I think for us to kind of continue to evolve and have the positions like the One Sommelier, where restaurants are taking this thing seriously, consumers have to value it more. So that's what hopefully you leave this talk with that message.
Can I add? Okay, there's one more there.
Sorry. I was just going to, again, ask on that. I mean, with consumers, does it come from the consumer understanding, or do we have to show them that they understand by charging more? You know, in a tap-and-go economy that we have today, where you just tap the card and walk off, particularly in Australia, I think, does the consumer really care about the cost? As long as they're getting their product, they're happy. Does our industry sometimes think too much on that? Are we worried about something that's not there, or yeah, or ...
Yeah, that is the billion-dollar question. I think that, you know, I can only speak to Intelligentsia. We have found that consumers are willing to pay more for coffee. When we have the coffee from Luiz Paulo, the geisha, the anaerobic processed blue, I mean, we're charging $50 for a 7-ounce bag. And, you know, we sell that out in 2 days. So it goes very, very fast. But I think there still is a perception amongst many consumers that if I can go down to the mass, coffee chain and pay $2 for a cup of coffee, we have to deliver something that is fundamentally different and that tastes better, that is different for consumers to start to appreciate, yeah, the $9 cup of coffee really does taste differently than the $2 cup of coffee. And I think that's where we still have opportunities as an industry collectively to more consistently deliver on that really high quality ingredient. Like, if you go back to what I started with, you can have a beautiful coffee bar with an amazing barista. If the coffee doesn't taste great, that customer is going to come once. They're going to try it once, and they're never going to come back. So I think there's a lot of factors at play, and I don't think I answered your question, but I think you get where I'm going.
Is there another question from the audience?
저는 이제 인텔리젠시아 CEO님께 질문을 드리고 싶은데요. 네.
Wait. Just a second. Like that. You have to get it. Yes, you go ahead.
지금 인텔리젠시아 커피가 미국의 인텔리젠시아 CEO님께 질문 드리겠습니다. 인텔리젠시아가 지금 미국에 7개 정도의 그 매장이 있는 걸로 제가 알고 있고, 전 세계적으로 15개 정도의 매장이 있는 걸로 아는데 들리시나요?
It was not loud enough. I hardly heard it, but can somebody in the audience translate shortly? Who understands? Otherwise, I just couldn't get it.
Yeah, same. It's a little faint. Oh, there we go.
네, 인텔리젠시아가 지금 미국에 한 7개 정도의 매장이 있는 걸로 알고, 전 세계적으로 15개 정도의 매장이 있는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 맞나요?
Intelligentsia has 15 coffee bars globally. So we have 3
네.
here in Seoul and 12 in the
네.
United States.
네, 그래서 그 중에 3개가 서울에 있는데 앞으로 아주 작은 서울에 지금 3개가 있어요. 아주 큰 미국에 대비해서 아주 작은 곳인데 앞으로 그 CEO님께서 생각하시기에 저희 그 서울의 그 스페셜티 커피의 산업, 커피 산업에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 3개나 운영을 하시는 매장을 오픈한 이유에 대해서 듣고 싶습니다.
Yeah, did you get it?
Yeah, I think so.
Good, yeah.
I mean, look, the specialty industry here in Seoul is unbelievable. Like the level of consumer interest in understanding coffee, in learning about coffee, is, I mean, it's remarkable. And so even though it's a smaller potential market, the level of interest is in what we do, as an example, is really, really exciting. So I think, I didn't totally get your question, but I think what we're excited about here in Seoul is just the ability to share what we do with coffee with a consumer base that is very, very interested in specialty coffee.
Yes, we will have later a talk from exactly about that subject, about the importance of the coffee shop culture here. Just to finish, I'd like to have a few more seconds this analogy with culinary. Do you think we should change the ceremony of a meal and bring coffee away from the end of the meal and bring somehow in the middle? Because it's how, wine comes early, soft drinks come early, water, coffee comes always to the end. Could we imagine a way to serve coffee that brings it into the middle of the meal or early in the meal so that you have a totally different integration into the meal? Then you can talk about culinary, but right now it's just at the end, and perhaps you should reimagine coffee as part earlier in the culinary process. I don't know if you have reflected on that.
I really believe this is the new trend because as we are developing different kinds of fermentation, some kinds of coffee we can use to complement the food. We can have some fermented coffee at the beginning, some washed coffee at the end of different positions. But I really believe coffee can be part of the show in some restaurants. If the people start to understand okay, I can present the food, but as a wine, okay, you can have some wine to fish, to steak. We can do exactly the same with coffee. I have this specific food, and to combine, we can use this kind of coffee. I think for the people doesn't want to drink alcohol, coffee can be a very good opportunity to complement in some restaurants.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would just say I would love to see that evolution in sort of the dining experience. But if we have to keep it at the end, then the chefs and the restaurateurs have to understand that, literally this is the last thing that a customer is leaving having experienced from their restaurant. So it should be the best, save the best for last, which is coffee, of course.
Yes. That's the best word to finish. Thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, and that makes the transition to our next speaker for me very nicely. Franz Zeimetz. He's Austrian originally, but he doesn't speak German. I just tried before. So, but he is an artist. I call this, it's like the new breed of artists who are really dwelling into the science of fermentation. He is part of this new breed of entrepreneur for me. It's a new type of farmer who are very innovative but also highly educated. And they have expanded the sensory space of coffee in a way that I would not have expected a few years ago. 10 years ago, the coffee that we drink from people like Franz, we wouldn't know them. They taste so different, so new, and perhaps he's the opening of the door to make it more culinary, also bring it earlier. So I'd like to welcome Franz and talk us about fermentation and about the expansion flavory spectrum of coffee.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Franz, and I am the founder of Lost Origin Coffee Lab. We are a coffee processing facility located in Panama City. After 10 years of experience in the world of craft brewing, we decided to apply our know-how of processing and fermentation into the world of specialty coffee. Today, I'll guide you on a fermentation journey, from craft beer to specialty coffee, from the beginnings in Casa Bruja to all the way up to producing the coffee that Martin used to win the 2024 World Brewers Cup. So the origin of Lost Origin. In this picture, you can see me at 18 years old, just graduated from high school. This was an event in which we were serving Casa Bruja for the first time. To my left, you can see Jonathan, who's the owner of the brewery, and to my right, you can see Richo, which is the creative mind behind Casa Bruja and Lost Origin. So when we started Casa Bruja, we only had 2 employees. It was me and Jonathan. So this was a crash course into the world of producing beer, following standard operating procedures, following recipes, understanding the importance of creating the right fermentation environment so that the yeast can produce delicious beer. Learning all about the importance of cleaning, sterilizing, and eventually we expanded into a group of 20 people. We created a barrel aging program. We started developing new products such as ready-to-drink seltzers. Casa Bruja is now one of the best breweries in Latin America. We were probably the first brewery to win an award at the World Beer Cup, which is the world's most prestigious beer competition. So during that time, 2019, we were thinking about all this ready-to-drink products, seltzers, and we were thinking of us more than a beer company. We were a flavor company, and we were an innovation company. So in this slide, I'll present the light bulb moment of when the transition came to be from craft beer to coffee. We went to this festival in Buffalo, New York, organized by Shelton Brothers, who at the time were importers into the US. They invited us to serve beer. In this festival, you had some of the best breweries in the world, from Belgium, from Germany, from the US. And all of a sudden, there were these guys that were serving cold coffee from a tap, from a beer tap. That immediately caught our attention. So when we went over to them and we started discussing what they were doing, and they mentioned they were fermenting coffee in El Salvador using beer yeast and other beer ingredients. The name of the company is Dark Matter Coffee from Chicago. As soon as we heard this, I just went straight down, like a rabbit hole of coffee processing. I started reading every research paper I could get my hands on. Before these, I didn't even know coffee was fermented. I'm from Panama. Panama has some of the best coffee in the world, but most Panamanians are not exposed to that coffee since most of that coffee is exported. So after this, we just went through a coffee rabbit hole, and we started exploring the coffee business. So we started, as I said, reading all the research papers, consuming all the information we could, but at the same time, we started reaching out to farmers in Panama. One of the first farms to open the doors for us was Santos Café, located in Santa Clara, Renacimiento, Panama. What I would do is I would send him yeast and bacteria and create protocols for fermentation. We did about 20 different experiments that year. This was in 2021. And one of those experiments got first place in varietals in the Best of Panama. It was a pacamara, washed pacamara with Vike yeast and Lactobacillus plantarum. So when we saw those results, we knew we were onto something. Since that happened, other farmers started getting interested in what I was doing, and I also had the opportunity to work with the Lamastus family. We did a bunch of trials with them, and some of those trials got into their private auction. So we were already seeing that what we were doing, processing coffee with yeast and bacteria, even in a rudimentary farm setup, made sense. So, as I said before, we were in the craft brewing world. We had no idea how the coffee business operated. So we started diving into the business of coffee. You had farms growing the cherries, you had mills processing those cherries, you had people selling green, you had roasters, and then you had retail coffee shops. We also started understanding how coffee was processed. So traditionally in Panama, coffee has been processed with a more mechanical mindset. People want to grab the cherry and then have green coffee as fast as possible. It's more focused on volume rather than taste. But slowly that had been evolving. In 2007, Joseph Brodsky from 90 Plus, he introduced the concept of naturals. Even naturals dried on an African bed were a new concept in Panama at that time. And then around 2015, you had people like Zeimetz and Zeimetz that started doing carbonic maceration, and it slowly started transitioning into a process that's more focused on the microbial side of the processing. Even though they didn't 100% understood that it was the microbes that were having an impact on that final cup. They would just say, this coffee tastes different, this is good. So we decided we wanted to be in the fermentation, drying, milling, and green coffee side of the business. Because in that area, we know we could, with our know-how of processing and fermentation, standard operating procedures, we could have a unique impact in the industry. In those months of research and exploration, we also found that coffee in Panama is a very traditional industry. It's an industry in which families have been farming coffee for hundreds of years. You have families like the Lamastus that have been farming for 117 years. It's a very traditional, family-oriented business. So we knew we needed to find a balance between tradition and the innovation that we wanted to put into the industry. We needed to respect what these families have done, the Lamastus, the Petersons, the Coiners, what they have done to create this image of Panama Geisha. We needed to respect what they had done. So this became one of the pillars of our company, finding that balance between tradition and innovation. We came up with the concept of from farm to lab. So after months of exploration, we decided we needed hands-on experience with coffee. It might be trickier than, it was trickier than it sounds because we're 8 hours away from Boquete. So we're in the middle of Panama City. So what I did was I built a homebrew setup with all the equipment even Jonathan had used to start the brewery. So small fermenters, pretty rudimentary equipment, but we had fermenters in which we could control the temperature. We were drying indoors with air conditioning, with dehumidifiers. So it was a rudimentary setup, but at least we had control of the variables. So after my day-to-day job at the brewery from 8 to 5, at night I would go up to this basic lab that we installed, and I would process small batches of coffee, 20 to 30 kilo batches of coffee. I had a small hand-cranked depulper, and I would spend all night just processing coffee, understanding how it worked, how different yeasts, how different bacteria, how different temperatures, how different fermentation times, how different drying methods, drying times would have an impact on the coffee. As you can see, this is a picture of me at the lab at that time. This was 3 years ago. I was dosing yeast into one of the fermenters. So with this, we had a minimum viable product. We did about 60 lots. So we had a minimum viable product. Now we needed a name for the company. At this point, Lost Origin didn't exist. So we started thinking about who we were, where do we come from as a group, who we are, and discussing that our partners are from, as I said, Austria. We have partners from Greece, partners from the UK, that we all converged in Panama. Thinking about that, we thought about coffee's migrant journey from Ethiopia, and then through a unique set of circumstances, it landed in Panama, where it now thrived. So in that meeting, we came up with the concept of, with the name of Lost Origin. So we had a minimum viable product, we had a name, now we needed a brand. This was us launching our brand for the first time. We grabbed some of the best lots that I had produced. Of those 60 lots, most tasted really bad. It's not coffee that you would want to drink today, but we found around 10 lots that we thought were really good. We also wanted to do something bold, something unique, something that connected our craft brewing mindset and that we wanted to make something unique for our clients that caught their attention, something bold. So we decided we were going to send samples in small cans purged with liquid nitrogen. So inside each can, you had 100 grams of green coffee, and we sent those samples to some of the best coffee roasters in the world. Now we had a minimum viable product, we had a name, we had a brand. It was finally time to execute the project. We had the opportunity to design this from the ground up. So we had a small space, and we use basically all the things that we had done wrong in the brewery, what we learned after 10 years, to create a lab that would be any brewer's dream. Custom drains, epoxy floors, everything is beautiful. Layout, super efficient layout. We basically use all the experience we had gotten in those 10 years to create this lab. Tanks. So when we started looking at fermenters, it's not like you can Google coffee fermentation tanks and you can just add to cart and buy one. We started seeing there were a couple options in the market, but none of them satisfied what we wanted. So we just grabbed a pen and paper and started designing our own custom-made tanks. It was very important for us to have temperature control, to have an agitator, to have pressure gauges where we can control the pressure inside the tank, different sample ports, and a CIP spray arm, so we could clean and sterilize the tanks between batches, which none of this was available in the current tanks that we were seeing some manufacturers in Colombia and Costa Rica were doing at the time. So we just started designing these tanks. It took about 2 years to finalize our first prototype. We worked with a factory in China. We would go back and forth just designing the tanks. So now we had our fermentation tanks. Then we needed to think about drying. We're 8 hours away from Boquete, the coffee growing region. We're in the middle of the city in an industrial area. So we couldn't just put the coffee outside and dry it in the sun. So then we started thinking, we started doing research on other industries that need to dry their product. We came across these drying racks in the middle. They're used for medical marijuana drying. So they're completely optimized for airflow. You're able to clean them, sterilize them, and they have worked perfectly for us. What we did was we built rooms that have air conditioning, dehumidifiers, they have HEPA filters to remove any of the excess microbes in the air, humidity control, ventilation systems. So that's how we dry now. This is a picture of the finalized lab. You can see all the fermenters. We have 3 small fermenters, 150 liters. You get about 20 kilos of green coffee from that fermenter. From the big one, you get around 120 kilos. So now I think this is the part everyone's most excited to think about, to hear about. This is a basic diagram of the process that we do. So I'll guide you through that process. As I said, 8 hours away from the farms. So what we do is we have a guy in Boquete, the coffee growing region, that goes to the different farms. We work with around 16 different farms. He picks up the cherries in the different farms. I don't know if you've seen them, but they give you a huge bag with cherries. It's like 100 pounds of cherries. We grab all those bags and then send them to a logistical center. Inside that logistical center, we empty the bags in individual 40-pound agricultural crates that have a plastic lining, so we protect the cherries. Those crates go into a refrigerated truck, and that refrigerated truck leaves Boquete around 6 p.m. and arrives at Panama City at around 2 a.m., and that's when we start processing. In this video, you'll see a little bit about the process. So the first step, when cherries come into the lab, we float them with cold water and 2% citric acid. This step is done to remove some of the excess microbes that are coming from the farms. Not only from the farms, but from the transport to the hands of everybody. So they get to the lab, float them, and then we depulp, I would say, 80% of our coffees. Then they go inside the tanks, and in the tanks we inoculate them with different strains of yeast and bacteria. Most of the times we're using a combination of yeast and bacteria. In coffee, you have a more diverse group of microorganisms that are working in that fermentation. It's not like beer. In beer, you only inoculate one organism, and that organism will digest the sugars from the starches from the grains and then create alcohol. In coffee, it's way more complex. So you need to create an environment in which the yeast and bacteria are working together. Some of them are lowering the pH, some of them are generating a little bit of ethanol, some of them have high enzymatic activity, and they're breaking down the pectin, which is a large sugar molecule. They're breaking it into smaller pieces so that the yeast and bacteria can actually digest them. So after fermentation, most of our fermentations are only 24 to 48 hours. What we want from that fermentation is to decompose the mucilage so that when the parchment goes into drying, there's no extra sugar available for any other microbes, for any other fungi, so the coffee is just as clean as possible. After fermentation, coffee goes into individual 5-kilogram trays, and then we send them into our drying rooms. We have a 3-stage drying process, which we copied from pasta drying. So if you dry the coffee too fast, it's gonna become brittle, and you're gonna have water in the middle of the grain. So what we do is we do an initial phase in which we have the humidity as low as possible, temperature a bit higher. We stabilize the coffee, dry it to the touch for 24 hours. After those 24 hours, it goes into a second drying room in which we do a stable, gentle drying for 10 days. And finally, it goes into a stabilization room before going into grain pro bags. So most people don't know that we've only been doing this for 1.5 years. And in those 1.5 years, we have accomplished a lot more than we would have ever dreamed of. We have a worldwide presence. We are in some of the best roasters in the world. People that I've admired for years have now become our clients. And also, last year, we got 10th place in BOP, the Best of Panama, which is one of the most prestigious coffee competitions in the world, with a washed geisha from Don Benji. And then finally, this year, we had Martin using Lot 67 from Finca Maya, a natural geisha fermented with piquia and lactobacillus that he used to win the 2024 World Brewers Cup. So as I said, we've accomplished things that we never thought were possible in such a short time. So this is giving us a sense that what we're doing makes sense, that what we're doing is helping the coffee, it's creating better coffee, more stable coffee. So we do feel at the moment that we have a responsibility to share our know-how, what we've learned with other producers in Panama. Because in Panama, people always think of Panama geisha and they think, oh, these farmers must have a lot of money. They're selling really expensive coffee. But you only hear about 10, 20 farms maybe. But in Panama, we have over 2,000 different farms that barely have access to the international market. They only sell cherries to local big mills that are producing the coffee that people drink on a daily basis. But if we can share our know-how, as we did with Finca Maya, we can empower these small farms to get the attention of the international market. It's a way in which we can impact the lives of thousands of producers in Panama. Finally, I'll present a small video in which you'll be able to get to know the team, know some of the people behind Lost Origin.
Me personally, in Lost Origin, we have a really diverse group, very different people, but we're all working towards the same goal, and each one has different characteristics that helps us get to that goal.
Franz is definitely, the scientist behind the scenes. I mean, he has a tremendous knowledge. Jonathan, I would say, is also a very technical guy, has a lot of technical knowledge. Andy, I would say Andy is the marketing guy, and the jokester is, without a doubt, Ricardo.
So in France you have wine, in Germany you have beer, and here in Panama you have coffee. Coffee is way more complex than beer or wine. It has a broader range of flavors, of expressions. It's a fruit that's then processed, and then it's dried, and then it's roasted, it's ground, it's brewed. So there's an infinite amount of complexity that goes into coffee, and we should appreciate that. Our mission in Lost Origin is to see where coffee can go, especially here in Panama, but even just in every producing country. Our first experience with coffee, we visited farms and we saw that there was a lack of know-how in processing, a lack of understanding in the impacts that microbes can have on the final cup. So we came in trying to control that process and respecting the raw materials, so respecting the coffee, treating it well, and seeing where it can go.
Thank you guys, and now I think we'll have a couple of minutes to answer any questions you guys might have.
Thank you very much, Franz.
Thank you.
May I start up with the first question, and then we have time for others. So, fermentation, I would say 10 years ago, nobody knew about. What is it that makes fermentation so unique? Flavor-wise, for example, what is it that it's adding in terms of flavor spectrum to the coffee world?
So to be completely honest, most people think we have a flavor mindset. Our mindset is more based on how to produce coffee in a systematic and standard way. So for us, the main thing about fermentation, about using different yeast and different bacteria cultures, is we want to produce coffee that's as clean as possible. You don't have, so you're using the yeast and the bacteria to decompose that mucilage, and then coffee goes into drying as clean as possible. So we're trying to present the cleanest and the most pure coffee, so that when we would go to farms, you would see all of these experiments, putting coffee inside a barrel for, I don't know, 3, 5, 7 days, and you would create this different expression of the coffee. But you didn't necessarily understand why this coffee was different, and then you would see farmers that were playing with the coffee, and that's also a risk for them, because some of those lots may be an incredible 90-point coffee that you're selling for a bunch of money, but then in the same cupping table, you have other experiments that didn't go that well. So it's also a risk for the producer. For us, we do see the benefits in flavor, especially in texture, in mouthfeel. But for us, it's I would say 80% of our coffees is just trying to produce coffee as clean as possible. And then 20% of that other side is that more experimentation side of us that comes from the brewing background. In beer, you have your traditional ales or lagers, but you also have smoothie sours that have a bunch of different fruits and flavors. So I would say we don't focus that much on the we're not thinking about creating a flavor. We're thinking about how to process this coffee in the most standard way possible, so that we have an even playing field, how we can basically not screw up the raw materials.
Yes. No. Yeah. Perhaps question from the audience to Franz.
예, 우리말로 하겠습니다. 그 발효 커피라는 게 잘 들리십니까? 오케이.
I can read it here.
예, 발효 커피가 갖는 어떤 그 장점랄까, 또 어떤 고객가치 측면에서 이게 어떤 장점이 있을지 이제 뚜렷이 이해가 좀 안 되고요. 그래서 이게 발효 커피가 과연 고객들 측면에서는 어떤 베네핏이 있을까, 그런 부분이 좀 궁금하고요. 그다음에 이제 이게 발효 커피를 통해서 어떤 연구를 좀 많이 하신 것 같은데, 어떤 그거를 좀 백업할 수 있는 리서치 레포트라든가 뭐 저널에 발표한 그런 내용이라 그런 부분이 좀 더 있을까 좀 더 궁금합니다. 그 마지막으로 국내에서 제가 뭐 좀 컨택을 해보려면 국내에 그 에이전시가 있는지 그런 부분도 좀 궁금하고요. 예.
So regarding the research reports, there's a lot of information online, especially around 2014, 2015. A lot of studies started coming up from Brazil. And they have done a lot of work doing controls versus adding yeast or bacteria, and you can see the differences from the cupping scores and also from chromatography results. So you can see how using different yeast and different bacteria can produce flavor compounds that are more positive for coffee drinkers, that people like more. The benefits for customers also is most of the roasters that buy from us, they know they're getting a coffee that was treated right, not only in the fermentation, but also, let's say, in the drying. Our drying phases don't reach a higher temperature than 22 degrees Celsius versus a traditional coffee mill, which is drying coffee at 40, 60 degrees Celsius. You preserve more of the volatile compounds. So it does improve the flavor profile, but it's not necessarily the main focus of our project. Our project is based on understanding the impact that microbes have on the final cup. We know they have an impact. I think most people are not at a point in which they understand exactly what X or Y microbe have on the final cup. It's not like you add piquia clueri and then you get a cup that tastes like strawberries. We still haven't figured that out, and that's what's so exciting for us. In beer, I just Google something, and then you get hundreds of answers. Everything has been studied. There's a huge tradition of beer making, so most of these studies have already been published. We know exactly the impact that this ale yeast is going to have. In coffee, we honestly have no idea. Maybe some of the big companies know exactly what's going on, but it's not public knowledge. So our role in the industry is trying to understand the impacts that microbes have on the final cup.
Yeah. I can just give a very short answer, There is two ways of forming aroma. There's the fermentation and roasting. And in the fermentation, you create the aroma in the green coffee, and they survive the roasting. These are mostly esters. So fermented aromas are fruity flavors that are generated in the green coffee, and they don't break away. They survive roasting. And the aroma that we know from coffee is a roast aroma. It doesn't exist in the green coffee. And fermentation brings a fruity aroma that is already in the green coffee. These are esters.
Yeah.
And we know that. But really what you're doing is, from your talk, is that you bring consistency to the fermentation, because fermentation is a very wild process. What we're doing is you bring a consistent scientific process, and whatever you produce, you are able to reproduce it consistently. So whatever it is, you can do it tomorrow and in a year also. And so that's what the customer wants. They want consistency. And I guess that's what you're doing. So fermented flavors are fruity flavors, esters, that are changed in the green coffee.
Yeah, the idea is just controlling as many variables as possible. So we built a lab in which we can control air quality. All the tanks are sterile. The drying facilities are sterile. You control temperature, humidity, all that. So after many, many years of experience and all the data that you've gathered, you can start seeing, if I inoculate this coffee from this farm, from this variety, and do a fermentation at 18 degrees Celsius for 2 days, and then dry the coffee at 20 degrees Celsius for 15 days, I'm starting to get this flavors. And then when you do the chromatography, you get the different esters and other flavor compounds. And that way you understand, if I do this, I'll get this. That's what we're trying to understand.
Any other questions?
I have one question. What do you think your mission is for coffee sustainability as a coffee processor?
So in terms of sustainability, I think it would be, what we're doing is trying to understand how to process coffee in a standardized way. So as I mentioned, you have a bunch of farmers that are just doing experiments with their harvest, a small harvest, and then they might be gambling in processing, because they have roasters that are telling them, do this process, do this. Most of the times you have one of those coffees that is incredible, but then you have a bunch of different coffees that you're not going to be able to sell. So for us, it's creating a standard way of processing coffee so that farmers are able to produce the most out of their harvest.
Yes.
강의 잘 들었습니다. 저의 질문은 이것인데요. 한국에 다양한 발효 음식들이 있는데 이것들은 굉장히 몸에도 좋고 유기농적인 측면에서 굉장히 이롭다는 이미지가 있습니다. 그런 것처럼 커피도 발효 커피라는 것은 굉장히 우리 몸에 이롭다라는 그런 느낌이 드는데 발효와 부패는 곰팡이로 인한 작용이지만 굉장히 결과는 다른 것이라고 생각을 합니다. 저희가 발효 커피를 지향하기 위해서 농가에 있어서 최소한의 갖춰야 될 노력과 그리고 유통업자가 갖춰야 될 최소한의 노력 그리고 커피하우스에서 갖춰야 될 최소한의 노력은 어떤 것이 있을지 궁금합니다.
Did you?
Yeah, just to translate in a way. So yeah, fermented in this country there are a lot of fermented products and they have all kind of a health connotation. And the question is, does fermented coffee also have health benefits that we could use? And what would you know about the health side of fermented coffee?
I've seen people marketing fermented coffee as cultured coffee and other marketing terms, but I wouldn't be sure if you're getting any health benefits because you're roasting those green beans, so there's no microbe that's gonna withstand the roasting process. That would be my take on that.
Yeah, I wouldn't have to add. It's in coffee we extract, so we don't eat the whole food.
No,
and that's why it's probably less functional, but otherwise I wouldn't say, I don't know.
No.
Any other questions? There.
네, 저는 제가 하고 싶은 질문은 일반적인 이스트나 바이러스를 이용한 발효를 제외하고 한국에서는 과일을 같이 넣어서 발효를 시키는 가양 커피가 어느 정도는 인기가 있는 편인데 이 가양 커피에 대해서 어떻게 생각하는지가 궁금하고요. 또 이 가양과 발효가 같이 섞여 있는 커피의 발전 가능성에 대해서 묻고 싶습니다.
So from what I understood, this is obviously one of the subjects at the moment. There's a lot of controversy in this, and co-fermentation and in infused flavor, infused coffees. I don't want to say we're completely against that. For us, the main thing is just being transparent with the process. I do think the idea of adding fruits to a fermentation tank, it's not that you're adding the flavor of the fruit, you're just adding a different culture of microorganisms. So if you're adding mango and you're placing it in a tank with coffee, you're not infusing that flavor into the coffee, you're just introducing another microbiome into that fermentation. But again, that's a very spontaneous fermentation. You're not controlling the inoculation of the microbes that you're putting inside. So you could be using just a combination of hundreds and thousands of different microbes, so you won't be able to replicate that. And I don't think you will get the flavors from the fruit into the coffee. And that's a whole other subject of infusions and things that are going on in the industry.
Yes. Any other questions? Yeah, infusion is a big subject right now, so it's good. Yeah.
We stay away from that.
Any other question? So I'd like to thank Franz again, and he's really pushing. I would really stress the importance of the consistency, because we master roasting now reasonably well. We are quite consistent in reproducing the roast. But since we are working with microorganisms, we have to establish new protocols which allow us to have a stable and consistent fermentation. So I guess that's where I would say you have really pioneered the industry, is to go from a wild fermentation to a controlled fermentation.
Exactly.
And that's where really the industry needs. Today, a customer, if they like a coffee, they want to see it again. And that's what you're providing. And so bringing rationally into the fermentation process is so important right now. Thank you very much. And continue.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, now I would like to move to our next speaker, who is somebody well known in the Korean ecosystem. It's Mr. Cho, who is, I guess, one of the biggest influencer, also a TV personality, a lecturer, and he's basically very active in the culture environment of Korea. And he's today here to talk about a subject that is interesting me perhaps more than you. How did South Korea become such an incredibly strong coffee shop environment? So I'd like to welcome you, and I'm really curious to hear your talk. Thank you, Mr. Cho.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Seoul. I see that more than half of you are from Seoul, but welcome to Seoul anyways. I'm a writer, and I make YouTube videos, usually about history of different countries. And in my career as a historical commentator working in the TV space and publishing space, I have come to collaborate with a few large coffee brands, like Kanu, Starbucks Korea, and Illy Espresso Korea. And that gave me an opportunity to compare Korean coffee culture with coffee culture of different countries. And I've come to realize that in Korea, we have a very unique and a very big thing going here. And while doing research for these videos, we have spoke with historians with the Korean coffee culture. And today, I would like to share that story with you, hopefully, especially for our foreign visitors. It'll give you some context, historical context for understanding what you're seeing in the space outside and also on the streets. I've picked how did Seoul become a coffee city as the topic for today's discussion. So what do I mean by Seoul being a coffee city? So first of all, there is the sheer amount of coffee being drunk. According to one consumer statistics, the world consumes, so an average person in the world consumes about 160 cups of coffee a year. An average Korean person consumes 367 cups of coffee a year. So that's almost twice the global average. So we drink enormous amounts of coffee. And that's why perhaps we can have this big worldwide event where coffee-related exhibitions can run up to 4 floors, and you've seen the lines outside. There's an intense interest in coffee in Seoul today. There are also many, many, many coffee shops in Korea. If you are interested in coffee, and that's why you're here, and if you walked into any alleyway in Seoul, you probably will encounter 10, 15, 20 coffee shops in any alleyway. Statistically, in Korea, for 100,000 people, there will be about 200 coffee shops. In Korea, there will be 1,400 coffee shops for the same amount of population. So there are just incredible number of coffee shops as well. So and there are some, other than the sheer number of coffee shops, there are some qualitative difference as well. Korean coffee shops, the best ones, are often very unique. So if you go to some really, really nice Korean coffee shops, you will find that they're usually built by top architects in collaboration with some modern artists. So they're exquisitely made out like a stage for modern art. They feel more like a gallery than a coffee shop. They often have a theme. Recently, I was in a coffee shop in Jeju Island, which is a volcanic island made entirely out of basalt, which is to the south of Korean Peninsula. And in this coffee shop, the older landscaping and the bar where coffee was served was made out of local volcanic rock. And they also have dessert cakes, galets. You know, galets in French means little pebbles, right? So they actually look like volcanic pebbles. And when you cut them open, you get sort of outflow of green tea lava. And of course, green tea is a crop that's grown largely in Jeju Islands. And this is not unique to these particular coffee shops. Usually best Korean coffee shops have a theme, whether it's tied to the locality or philosophy of the person who makes them. Another specificity of best Korean coffee shops are they're often ephemeral. Best European or American coffee shops, they've been around for 50, 70, 100, 150 years, sometimes 300 years. But some best Korean coffee shops, not all of them, but a lot of best Korean coffee shops, they appear out of nowhere. They become a cultural icon in a matter of a few weeks. They are there for 6 months to a year, and they disappear. And usually, people find out on the grapevine that the owner is talking to a new interior designer or talking to a different dessert chef in order to create a different coffee shop with a different concept somewhere else where the locality tells an interesting story. So both in terms of quantity of coffee being drank and the number of coffee shops and the variety the coffee shops are offering, Seoul has become an international coffee city, which wasn't the case just 15 years ago, where if we went to a nice Italian restaurant and ordered a ristretto, no waiter would know what a ristretto is. I mean, Koreans among us remember that time when you couldn't order espresso at an Italian restaurant. That has entirely changed. Just on my apartment block, there are 6 coffee shops. One of them specialized in Austrian-style coffee, so they serve Einspanners and Kaiser Melange. The 2 coffee shops supposedly specialize in Australian-style lattes, and 2 coffee shops make roast their own beans. So that's the variety of coffee shops you get in Korea. And this scene has attracted the attention of East Asian consumers all over the continent, especially female consumers in their teens and 20s. So if you go to YouTube and if you search in Japanese, those of you who can, or if you search in Vietnamese, content about traveling in South Korea, you will see 16 to 25 or 5-year-old young women from all over Asia coming to Korea specifically just to tour coffee shops. Like a musical lover of my generation would specifically go to London or New York to go see Broadway shows. There are people coming from all over Asia just to go to coffee shops. And like I said, this is really developed in the last 10 years. So how did this happen is today's discussion. And while deciding how to tell this story, I found out something interesting. This period of rise of Korean coffee culture coincides in time, in historical time, with the rise of K-pop, then rise of Korean TV shows and rise of Korean TV shows. And if you think back at history and all the great coffee shops that are historical that tourists flock to in Europe now, those coffee shops were at its peak also when those cities were at their cultural peak. So while telling this story, I tried to figure out whether there is a real link between the cultural flowering of a city and the flowering of the coffee culture there. And if so, it could tell us a very interesting story about why people here do what you do, right? Most of you here grow coffee, harvest coffee, select coffee, right? Roast coffee, serve coffee, market and brand coffee, and the reason that this is such a big industry that all of you are working in it, it's because there is some innate human need for a place called coffee shop. And if cultural flowering and flowering of coffee culture usually goes hand in hand in history, and it could reveal something about what it is that you guys do as part of a human ecosystem. So I thought this was a story worth telling. So history of Korean coffee probably goes back to about 1945, when Japan surrenders to the Allies in World War II. Now, of course, there was coffee in Korea before that. For example, if you are here in Seoul, for a short period of time, one place, if you are interested in coffee, I strongly recommend you visit, is there is a palace called Deoksugung, which is one of the smaller palaces. There are 5 royal palaces in Seoul. Deoksugung is one of the smaller palaces. The last king, one of the last kings of Korea, one of 2 last kings of Korea, Gojong, lived there, and he was trying to westernize his court at the time, because this was at the age of the peak of European imperial powers. And he had some advisors, and he asked them, what do they drink in Europe? And they said, well, sir, in Europe, they drink coffee. So he had a pavilion built to drink and serve coffee with and to Western delegates. So that's one of the first places where coffee was served in Korea, according to historical records. Starbucks sometimes holds events there where they still serve coffee there because this was the first place where coffee was served, supposedly. I'm sure there were people who drank coffee before that, but that was the first historical record in Korea of coffee being served. But most people in Korea didn't drink coffee. Well, the first Koreans who drank coffee called it 양탕국, which means something like medicinal elixir from overseas, right? Because it was bitter and it reminded them of herbal treatment that Korean people used to take when they were sick. So they figured that it was some kind of a medicinal elixir. It came from the West, so it came across the ocean. So the taste probably took a little getting used to. And most Korean people probably couldn't even get it, right? Because it was being imported. It was something precious. It was something expensive. So most Korean people usually boiled barley, boiled tree root, boiled tree barks in the traditional way, and they drank that. But in 1945, Japan surrenders to the Allies. Korea, which was occupied by Japan, gains its independence. And southern part of Korea, the Americans come in the northern part of Korea, the Soviets come in, and we still have North and South Korea for that region. So Americans were present in Korean history from the very beginning. As Korea was constructing itself as a modern nation, the American influence was there. And one of the things that Americans brought, along with their music, their political system, their education system, and their language, one of the things they brought is coffee. And what kind of coffee they brought is extremely important in understanding what kind of coffee that Korean people drink today. Now, US Army brought coffee wherever it went, right? Because Americans had invented ingenious ways of transporting coffee very early on. So already at the era of Civil War, so in the 1860s, Americans had this canned coffee elixir called essence of coffee that they would sell at different camps that the Union Army travels to. And you could basically pour out this very strong coffee from this can, maybe into 10 different cups, and you pour hot water over it. So it's like a primitive Americano. And a platoon could share a hot cup of coffee before going into battle. So this effort to sort of make coffee portable and make coffee last on the battlefield has been a constant research in the US Army. And by the time the Americans came to Korea in 1945, and more massively to fight in the Korean War in the early 1950s, they brought with them not this kind of concentrated canned coffee, but this kind of coffee, instant dry freeze coffee. So if you ask any Korean person over age of 40, what does coffee look like? That person will say, coffee looks like this. So you have to understand this generation gap. In order to understand coffee culture in Korea, there is 2 coffee generations in Korea. There are people over 50, probably now people over 50 now, because we age, for whom coffee means this kind of coffee, the kind of coffee that they bought from US military bases when coffee wasn't really available in Korea. And why did this coffee become so popular? If you look at Korean history, I think we can find a hint. Korean War was one of the most destructive wars in world history. There were more bombs dropped in Korean Peninsula during the Korean War than all the bombs dropped in the Pacific Theater during the entire World War II on this small piece of land. So you can imagine there was nothing left standing. So you can imagine the people who went through the war, they are not going to move back into houses with stoves and heat, right? They had nothing. But they were used to drinking because Korea had this tea and infusion culture, something warm. And the advantage of this kind of instant coffee was that you didn't need a stove, right? You could go to a place where there was a stove, like a kitchen or a restaurant that you knew, and you could ask them for hot water, put it in a thermo that you could also get from the American soldiers. And then if you have it in your corner, whenever guests come in, you just pour some instant freeze-dried coffee, you pour water over it, and then, bam, you have a little tea house, right? And this was instrumental in how Korean sort of culture survived as well. So in the case of the U.S., when World War II ended and better coffee became available, when donut shops start serving drip coffees, or when Starbucks started building their franchises, the Americans basically abandoned this type of coffee. This was a relic of World War II. We are at the peacetime. We have good coffee. We don't need to drink this coffee anymore. And that was because the West had a coffee culture before this coffee came in. So for the Westerners, they had a default coffee idea to snap back to once that was available. But mind you, in Korea, most people's idea of what coffee was this kind of coffee. So Korea went in a different route. When Korea started developing and when Korea started becoming richer, instant freeze-dried coffee became really diverse and really high quality. So if you watch any Korean TV shows, you're going to see that in any Korean office, you will have a little corner of the office with a little basket, like plastic basket, like you see here. You see here with sticks of instant freeze-dried coffee. You see this? And then you will see that there are many kinds as well, right? So like this one, supposedly reenacts the taste of a real Americano, but you can do it in a snap. This one here, it says a simple latte, right? So instead of having to make your own latte with an espresso machine, you can just pour water over that, and you're gonna get a taste that approximates a latte. And this, and then when Korean people see this kind of scene in a TV show where this person is pouring 2 whole packs of instant freeze-dried coffee, we know exactly what that person is feeling, because every Korean office worker has a specific way they pour the contents of that pouch into the cup. Because if you take a instant freeze-dried coffee and you buy it in Korea, usually the way to structure this, the coffee is at near the entrance, and then you have powdered milk in the middle, and you have sugar on the far side. So depending on where you put your fingers, you can block the amount of sugar or amount of milk that goes into the coffee cup. So you can make it black coffee, you can make it into a latte with no sugar, or you can make it into an extremely, extremely sweet coffee. So when somebody is pouring 2 whole packs of coffee into the cup without measuring how much sugar or coffee goes into it, that person's really stressed out. We know that that person needs caffeine and sugar now, right? And this kind of coffee culture, I think, translates to what most Korean office workers drink during the day. I'm not talking about those fancy coffee shops with concepts and design that we talked about before. I'm going to get to that. But we need to first build a base for understanding what kind of coffee that ordinary Korean people drink every day. And most ordinary Korean people drink fairly diluted versions of iced Americano, cold Americano. And if you walk down the street in an office district, you'll usually see these coffee shops that have some allusion to how big their coffee cups are. So obviously this coffee brand is called Mega Coffee. And you also have a coffee brand called Mammoth Coffee. So they promise they're gonna give you lots of coffee, and it's usually fairly diluted iced Americano. And I think the one part of why this kind of coffee fit the taste of Koreans is because we grew up drinking this type of coffee. So this type of coffee doesn't have a lot of very strong flavors, right? It's fairly diluted in taste already. So most Koreans are used to drinking coffee without such a concentrated flavor. So that's one thing. And when I was making a content about why Korean, like a small mini documentary about why Korean people prefer iced Americano, there were some interesting feedbacks as well. You know, Korean people have an intense working culture, right? A lot of Korean people work until 9, 10 o'clock at night. So some of my subscribers responded by saying the iced Americano is in fact intravenous injection of caffeine that office workers keep around because they get sleepy at 9 p.m. and they still have to keep working. So they just keep it there. You know, whenever they need caffeine, they boop, you know, they take a shot of iced Americano, and then they go back to work. But I think more interesting insight came from how it matches our food. Right? If you've been in Korea, you know that most Korean food is spicy and brothy. So they are drinking spicy, hot, water-based food for lunch. Right? So if you had hot liquid for lunch, do you want to have hot liquid after lunch, or do you want to have something cold to wash it down, right? You usually want something cold to wash it down. And if you think about hot espresso type drinks, they are a little bit rougher, right? They sometimes grate on the throat a little bit. If you had really spicy food, that's probably not what you want, right? So I think one reason that Korean people love iced Americano is first they were trained on this type of coffee all their lives, and second, they usually, and they're really stressed out at work, so they want something cold with a lot of caffeine to wake them up, but also because our food is usually hot and watery, very brothy, so you usually want something cold and not something not so strong to wash that down. Now, the latest development of this coffee trend is this trend. So this is kind of an interesting experience that a lot of, especially teens and people in their teens and 20s come to do when they come to Korea. So in Korea, what you can do is you can walk into a convenience store and you can buy a cup with ice in it, which is very cheap. And you can also get this pre-packed pouch of iced Americano. So what you do is young people who are trying to get their start, who are struggling with high rent in Korea, they want to have a cup of coffee by themselves, without spending too much money. Where do they go? They go to a convenience store. They buy this cup of frozen ice that they were selling separately, and then they buy this pouch of concentrated coffee, much like the American essence of coffee that they were using back in the Civil War days, and they would pour this concentrated coffee over ice, and then they would drink it. And this was the cheapest way to get your coffee fix in Korea for the last 10 years. And then they started improvising on TikTok and Instagram Reels and coming up with interesting recipes. And one recipe that really went viral is that any Korean convenience store will have this strange shaped milk. So it's not just milk, it's milk with sort of artificial banana flavors. And Korean people have a fond memory of this milk because it's usually what your parents gave you when you're good, right? So a lot of Korean people found out that you could take this cup of ice, pour pre-packaged Americano in it, pour some banana-flavored milk in it, and shake it, and you can get something approximating a very nice potato latte or banana latte. And this has gone viral in all East Asia. So now, in those coffee tour videos where Japanese influencers come to Seoul to visit a lot of different Korean coffee shops, at the end of the tour, they will go to a convenience store and they will try different mixes of a banana milk and prepackaged coffee. So because coffee has taken this route, coffee has become an everyday drink for Korean people, which hasn't happened in many Asian countries. Like if you go to different Asian countries, coffee is something that you still go somewhere to drink and enjoy. And they still have their traditional drink for entertaining people in the family or having time by themselves. But in Korea, due to these historical reasons, coffee has become our default go-to drink, which explains why Korean people consume so much coffee compared to global average. Now, that was for coffee, but the coffee I've talked about until now, it's far cry from kind of coffee shops that I talked about with architects designing these coffee shops, with desserts that are specifically made to fit the ecosystem in which the coffee shop is. So how did that culture develop? The reason I divided this lecture into two sections is that I think we need to distinguish coffee as material and coffee shops as a space. So tracing the development of coffee shops in Seoul, I came very close to finding out why coffee shops are necessary for a cultural city to be a cultural city. So let's see what happened in Korea after the Americans came in. So Americans come in, and they have enormous influence on Korean culture. So Korean people watch Hollywood movies, and they read American books, and the idea of sort of individual freedom comes in. And mind you, American culture was pouring into Korea in the 1960s, and this was at the height of the hippie era. So it was very sort of the kind of American culture that the first generation of Americanized Korean youth got was the hippie version. And Korean society was still really conservative. And this generational conflict show up on archival photos like this. So on the left, you have a young lady who's obviously inspired by the miniskirt craze in the US in the 1960s. Maybe she's a fan of Nancy Sinatra or Delilah, who knows? And there's a police officer who has pulled her over, and they're measuring the length of the exposure of the thigh. I kid you not, there was a law in South Korea stipulating how short you could wear your skirt. I believe it was 15 centimeters above the knee. So you could get pulled over if you're wearing something too risque. The policeman will take out a ruler, and if the distance between your knee and the bottom hem of your skirt was more than 15 centimeters, I think it was fine, and you were sent home. On the male side, all the craze was long hair, right? This was the age of Beatles, right? So men like to grow out their hair, imitate American fashion, and the conservative Korean older generation didn't like it. So there was a law forbidding the American long-haired fashion. The American hippie hair was forbidden. So if you had long hair, police could stop you. They could take you to a police station. They would call a barber, usually not a very good one, and cut your hair off, right? In a style yet you certainly didn't like. So this is the period in which Korean coffee culture develops and why. Now you imagine a country that's rapidly westernizing. So the cultural gap between the older generation and younger generation is huge, right? But in Korea, real estate was already fairly expensive. And in Korea, usually you didn't leave your parents' home until you got married, which meant that you were living with your parents who think very differently than you do until you are 22, 25, 30 years of age, which is more common in the world today, but at the time, it was something very specific to Confucian cultures. So you imagine this kind of cultural conflict going on between the generations, and young people have to go home, and until they're 25, they're living with their parents. Obviously, they're going to need somewhere where young people can gather, listen to music they like, converse without being monitored by their parents, and most importantly, meet people of opposite sex without their parents asking them who their parents are you intending to marry them, etc. So the first coffee shop in Korea, the first modern coffee shop in Korea is considered this coffee shop here, called Hangnim Coffee Shop. And if you see the date here, it was founded in 1946, right? If you remember what I said in the previous section of the lecture, Korea became independent from Japan in 1945, and the Americans came in immediately after. So you can see that this coffee shop's history has been there since the very beginning of westernization of Korea. And this is kind of interesting because on the bottom, right underneath the coffee shop, there is a record store. And if you look at the record store, it says imported record, right? So you can see that people who gather here, they might go to a record store, they pick up a record, a CD, a LP of people, of musicians that their parents don't approve of. This coffee shop being sort of the gathering place for younger generation of Koreans who needed a place for them to interact without being watched by the older generation. I think this is what gave spread of coffee shops in Korea a very strong impetus. So even in today's Korean TV shows, you can see Hangnim Coffee Shop appear over and over. So Hangnim Coffee Shop, much like Café de Flore in France or Café du Magot, was in a university neighborhood. Seoul National University was at a different place then. And Hangnim Coffee Shop was right across from one of the best universities in Korea. So a lot of literary types or people who are into art, they would hang out here, discuss art, discuss literature, discuss risky politics that they might not be able to discuss at home if their parents are around, and also, to meet people of opposite sex. Now, in Korea, what happened was that this generation conflict ended with young people just overwhelming the older generation. So in Korea, there were a lot of, in my parent generation, like my father had 6 brothers and sisters. So numerically, the younger generation, so many more people from the younger generation from the older generation. That was one thing. And second factor was that Koreans were very, very adamant about educating their children. So now today, Korea has the highest college attendance rate of any country in the world. That's 75% of people having gone to college. So you have young people who are more in terms of number and more educated, and they are the ones who are holding the pen. They're the ones writing articles. They're the ones writing music. They're the ones planning concerts. There was no way that older generation could stand up to them. And by the late 1980s, the youth culture completely sweeps away the older generation's culture, and you have birth of what's called the Korean Gen X. And in order to understand Korean culture, whether coffee culture or any other culture or K-pop, you need to understand this particular generation who spent their teens and 20s in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Before 1987 or 88, a Korean person couldn't travel overseas without a good reason approved by the government. The first regular travel passport was given out in 1989 after Seoul Olympics in 1988. And then in 1989 or so, a lot of strictures involving which books you could import or which record you could import or which movies you could watch, a lot of the strictures just evaporate. So what happens is you have an entire generation of youth who's confronting about 60 or 70 years of European and American cultural development all at once, right? Because it was all forbidden. So existentialism and surrealism came in at the same time as German techno and Japanese anime. And this swarm of culture that's flooding into Korea are being filtered and rearranged and being reimagined by this generation of people. So you get something like K-pop, right? If you look at the most famous K-pop directors, they were icons of this generation. So for example, one of the first quote-unquote K-pop female idol groups are considered the Wonder Girls, who were the first Korean musical group to make it to Billboard 100 in 2012. And the person who produced it was this artist named JYP, who caused a stir by wearing on public broadcast a pair of transparent vinyl pants. Now, if you're from the US, you're like, hey, what's the big deal? In Korea, there was still censorship, so he said he had to change the pants right before he went on the stage so the stage director couldn't shut off the lights, right? For example, one of the icon of this generation was this group named the Sotteji and Kids, and you can see their sort of Western and Japanese and European inspiration from the way they dress. And this gentleman on the right, Yang Hyung-suk, who was a dancer, whose fashion is obviously inspired by reggae music and the Caribbean culture, has gone on to become one of the biggest K-pop producers in the world, and he produced the Blackpink, which is the biggest K-pop band in the world right now, pretty much. So you can see the enormous influence of this generation, and this generation drank coffee. Why? Right? They hung out in coffee shops a lot. They dated in coffee shops. They listened to music in coffee shops. And this is one of the reasons that Korean people love coffee shops was because these people turned coffee into something young and hip and new. And why was that? I found a hint while reading a book called Weird by Professor Joseph Henrich of Harvard University. So Professor Joseph Henrich wrote this book called Weird, which explores the culture of what he calls the Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic people. And he says that there's a reason that beginning about 1500, creativity, whether artistic or industrial, exploded in the Western cities. That these weird people, these Western industrialized people, began to have a mindset about social relationship that was a little different from people of other countries, and that's what gave impetus to this Renaissance and this Industrial Revolution. And what are those two characteristics? One is a characteristic that Professor Joseph Henrich calls impersonal prosociality. So what does that mean? It means that if things are right, you could potentially be friends with anybody. Right? If you think about more traditional societies, there was a definite line on who you can hang out with. Right? You hang out with people you know, your bloodline. And then you hang out with people who are in your same social class or people who are from the same area, because you could trust them and you knew about them and you knew their back history. But because of urbanization that starts in medieval Europe around 1300, a lot of Europeans and Americans have shifted culture where you could easily just introduce yourself to somebody who's next to you and start sharing about your ideas, your life, and potentially get a new project going. The second aspect of Western culture that he points out that contributed to flowering of culture and art in the West is what he calls voluntary association. So if you're in the Middle Ages, of course, if you're born in the royal family, you are a member of that organization. You don't choose which organization you're going to belong to, But in Europe, beginning with the religious organizations, people started saying, okay, I was born in this city, but I'm going to move to another city and join that city. So I was born into a family that does this, I'm going to join that guild and learn different trade. So in a way, impersonal pro-sociality and voluntary organization goes together, and this opens up enormous possibility, right? So instead of talking to only people that grew up the same way as you do, if you can strike up a conversation with somebody you don't know, and maybe you have a more interesting conversation because you have experience that you don't share already, and something new can flower, right? And if those people can say, okay, let's form a guild, let's form a corporation, let's form a corporate of artists, and if they can work together, and obviously they can do something much more original, much more interesting. And I come to think, in studying the history of Korean coffee shops, that there is a specific physical space that allowed this to happen, both in the West and in Korea. There was a physical stage in which impersonal pro-sociality happened, where you could sit down and speak to somebody next to you, even if you didn't know them. And that space was coffee shop. So if you go back in the history of music, you have a very famous coffee shop in a city called Leipzig in Germany called Cafe Zimmermann, right? I mean, if you're professionals of coffee, I'm sure you guys know about this legendary coffee shop, right? In history of music, this coffee shop is super important, right? Georg Telemann, Baroque composer, met Johann Sebastian Bach there, and they were discussing problems with temperament of organs and how to tune their piano correctly. And they came up with an entirely new musical theory, which gave rise to modern classical European music. So a lot of this new music was born because there was a good coffee shop there. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of other factors, but the fact that there was a good coffee shop in Leipzig has a lot to do with the fact that for the subsequent about 150 and 200 years, some of the best composers in the world were German-speaking composers, right? And if you look at London, right? In London, the center of world shipping, insurance, and finance, everybody knows about the legendary Lloyd coffee shop, right? Where people would gather around, hang out with the people they don't know personally or they're not related to by blood, but they would make interesting games like bet on whether a ship would come in or ship would sink. And then that eventually evolved into modern maritime insurance system, which enables our globalized world to function. So if you look at the history of the world, it's not rare that coffee shops were physical places in which those cultural transformations mentioned by Professor Joseph Henrich actually took place, right? Even if you were in Europe in 17th century and where there was supposedly impersonal pro-sociality, you couldn't just walk up to somebody's house, knock on their door and say, hey, let's discuss some business, right? There was some context as to where this could happen, and that context was often coffee shops. And in Korea, this happened in a very similar way. So one type of a coffee shop that was very popular in Korea during the Korean Gen X, that recreated in a lot of Korean TV shows, is the music or record coffee shop. Like I said, one of the reasons that people went to coffee shop was to listen to music that older generation do not approve of. And at this time, usually, you didn't have iPhones. You had big record players. Usually there was one at home, if that. And usually, like my father, never let me near it because it was a very delicate machine, right? If you do something wrong, you chip the needle and then it doesn't work anymore. So it was the record machine was sort of the sanctuary of the father, right? You couldn't listen to music you like because you weren't even supposed to touch the machine. So where did the young people go to listen to music? They would go to these coffee shops, right? And they would have these sort of like a music box, and they would have a DJ, right, with a discotheque, right? And then you would write down which music you want to hear, and the DJ would play the music for you. And you drink coffee and listen to music. And this enabled impersonal pro-sociality because if you like Guns N' Roses, let's just say, and somebody else asks for Guns N' Roses, you're like, hey, I like that band too. I'm going to sit down next to you. Let's just strike up a conversation. And a lot of the early K-pop bands, if you read into their history about how those guys met, a lot of those guys met in a setting like this. So you see why the rise of diversity of coffee shops is closely related to rise of cultural flourishing in that city. Another role that Korean coffee shops played was it was basically an office for most entrepreneurs in Korea in the 1980s. In Korea, the venture boom was really in the 1970s and 80s, right? In the industrial sector. So today we don't think about industrial sector as being entrepreneurship. We only think about the IT sector. But in Korea, everything had to be built. There were lots of business opportunities back in 1960s, and a lot of people with some knowledge, they just graduated from college, lots of ideas, no capital, no office. They often would give out their coffee shop address as their office address. They would give out their coffee shop phone number as their office phone number, and a lot of these coffee shop owners answer the phone as if they were a secretary. So the coffee shop provided some front. It was like WeWork before it existed, some front to the legitimacy of your business. So you don't have to show how squalid your squalid living condition to your potential client. You just invite him to a coffee shop, nice coffee shop. You have a coffee, you discuss business in an environment that seemed more respectable. In the 1990s, these coffee shops fit a certain niche of young people who are ambitious, who are creative, wanting spaces where they can hang out with the interference from the older generation, where they could hang out with the people they don't know and strike up a conversation, where they can go to meet people with the same taste and same interest. And in the 1990s, the number of coffee shops started exploding. But what's interesting about this particular phase in Korean coffee shop expansion is that coffee wasn't very good. They were often very bad. And people didn't go to these coffee shops to drink coffee. They went to get what's called coffee-based dessert. So mind you that in order to understand Korean coffee, you have to understand that the taste of older generation of coffee drinkers in Korea was formed by freeze-dry instant coffee. That's what they knew. So what these coffee shop owners would do is they would basically take this instant coffee and make ice cream out of it, or they would make syrup out of it and pour it over ice cream, creating some kind of a sundae or some kind of a cake, and then people would consume this as a dessert with another cup of coffee, which often was terrible. So, and the impetus for shifting Korean coffee culture from just providing a space and serving okay coffee to serving really good coffee really came in 1999 when Starbucks opened its doors in Korea. So after Starbucks came to Korea, there was another generation shift. So you had older generation who are very culturally conservative. You have the Korean Gen X who are hanging out in coffee shops, listening to music. And then you have people who are going to coffee shops who grew up with Starbucks, who's more used to sort of American-style chain coffee shops where everybody sort of sit there with their laptop and they work on their homework and assignment. And because a lot of Starbucks coffee opened at like a hip university area, and a lot of people who are going to top colleges hung out there, and that carries an extremely heavy cultural weight in Korea. Like if you go to top university in Korea, you're basically cool. So a lot of people thought, okay, hanging out at coffee shops is cool. So coffee shops became like symbolically somewhere cool to hang out in. And 7 years after Starbucks coffee launched, there was a Korean TV show. And in Korea, everything is related to TV shows. So there was a Korean TV show called Coffee Prince, where a young person, instead of going to work at nice job in Samsung or Hyundai where they would grind down his soul, he decided to get together with his friends and create a coffee shop, a nice coffee shop where people can gather, have a conversation, have a great cup of coffee. And this became a huge hit Korean K-drama. And this TV show had the impact of letting people know that there was a job. This was a professional job to serve coffee, that there was such a thing as a barista. And the coffee making was very specialized, and it was a respectable job. So a lot of young people who weren't academically inclined, who didn't want to go to college to major in economics, saw another way out, right? I can be a really good barista. I can create coffee shops. And about at the same time, Illy Espresso makes their first chain coffee shops in Korea. That came in about 2006. And then a lot of Korean people began to realize that there are more than one kind of coffee. So there's the traditional Korean coffee dessert made from freeze-dried coffee. but there's also the American specialty store type of coffee, but there's also the traditional Italian espresso. And a lot of Korean people who are inspired by this type of drama, K-drama, to go study coffee, went over to Australia, went over to Austria, they went over to France, to Italy, to learn different coffee techniques. And when they came back to start all the different coffee shops was around the time that I started this lecture with, which was about 2015. So how to illustrate how far this has come, let me tell you an anecdote from my personal life. So I spent a year or so in Italy in 2011, and I came back to Korea, and I became one of these insufferable snobs who spent a few months in Italy and thinks he knows everything about coffee, right? One of these insufferable guys who spend a few months in Italy, come back and constantly complain about how you can't get real coffee in Korea, right? So at that time, my publisher took me out to a fancy Italian restaurant in Gangnam, which is like a very swanky area of Seoul. And the chef was Italian. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to, this gives me two opportunities. One is to get my Italian coffee fix, and two is to be a douchebag by ordering something that my publisher doesn't know. So I asked them, can you make me a ristretto? And the waiter didn't know what it was. So I said, can you make me an espresso? The waiter still didn't know what it was. He said, we only have coffee. This was not that long ago. And this was at a fancy Italian restaurant, and this was not that long ago. This was just 12 years ago. And then we went from that in 12 years through the cultural development, a city where in an ordinary apartment block, you have 6 different coffee shops serving 6 different national styles of coffee. So I think the exploration of a Korean coffee culture is, I think, a fascinating one, because the Korean coffee industry is really young but really robust at the same time. And because it's not so tied down by tradition, it has more room to explore. But I think exploring this story and comparing it to flourishing of a coffee culture in Paris when Café de Flo and Café du Magot and Café Payette was at its peak, or you compare it to coffee shops like Café Zimmermann in Austria, you find interesting parallels. When a city, a country industrializes and urbanizes, a lot of the old personal connection gets broken, right? You don't live with your parents anymore, right? Your relatives don't speak to each other as often, right? You don't know all the people living in your neighborhood anymore, and a person gets lonely. And that person who's living in a city either by himself or with a close group of 2 or 3 friends needs a home. Home in the sense not as a physical structure, but home in the place where you can walk into a place and feel that you're welcome, that you know people, and you can speak to people next to you, right? And I think if you look at history, most of the best coffee shops were in a city at the time that city was industrializing and urbanizing the fastest. And it was in this space called coffee shop that a lot of the unique culture of that city fermented, ripened, and exploded. And I think that's what essentially coffee shops are for. In a society where you don't talk to your neighbors, where you don't speak to your cousins, you need a place that you can call home. And for a lot of people in 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s in Korea, as well as 1920s and 1930s in Paris, coffee shop was sort of a substitute home. So I think people who are creating good coffee shops are doing something really important, because what you're doing is you are providing a sense of home to people who live in your neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. I now understand why you are a TV celebrity. It was really fascinating the way you brought this story of coffee culture growth in this country. And yeah, I recognize a little bit things that happened in European cultures, slower, at a different pace. It's really, you're also describing a little bit this fracture between generations that also did drive this. Do you think this is today, in now looking worldwide, because you seem also to have a a global view, you know, a multicultural person. Where do you think something similar could happen, or is happening right now, or is that unique to the Korean culture? This phenomena.
I think if you look at a lot of Asian countries, you see a lot of historical commonalities. So most Asian countries, like I was saying in my lecture, started out being a colony of some imperialist power, and then they became independent, and they go through a civil war, and then there is usually a morally conservative dictator that cracks down on the youth, and then youth rebels. Those stories are the same. I think what's unique about Korea is that eventually the youth just overwhelms the older generation, and they make the younger culture default culture for the entire country. So I think in many other countries in Asia I visited, the tension is there, the generation tension is there, and young people who are frustrated, they do gather in coffee shops there. But if the older generations are not relinquishing their influence, they usually end up reverting to the old way of socializing, right? So when they pass 25, pass 30, they're gonna hang out at tea shops that they're familiar with, or they hang out at places, pavilions that people in the village have always hung out in. But in Korea, because whether for good or bad, and there are many side effects of this as well, the youth culture in the late 1980s completely wiped out basically the older generation's culture. So the coffee shops have become a default. And that unfortunately also means that older way of interacting has disappeared as well. But that's why I think Korean people obsess over coffee shops so much, because it almost becomes like their identity. Like when you upload on Instagram, I went to this particular coffee shop with this concept and this design, and I drank this coffee. It's not just like I drank this coffee. It's more like I belong to this tribe of people that appreciate this kind of design and this kind of taste.
Okay, I would have hundreds more questions, but I'd like to let the audience speak, because you are here at home. Perhaps audience would like to talk to Mr. Cho about all his insights. So please. I don't see. You can also talk in Korean, yeah.
Yes, I speak Korean. That's my mother language.
우리말로 하겠습니다.
예.
이제 뭐 한국이 커피 공화국이라고 다들 이야기하는데 이게 이제 뭐 글로벌하게 사실은 어떤 그 핵가족화되고 사람들이 어떤 그런 그 만남의 장을 요구하고 그런 트렌드는 다 동조화되고 비슷할 것 같은데, 유독히 이제 대한민국만 이렇게 커피가 많이 마시고 커피 문화가 이렇게 아주 붐을 이루는 게, 지금 그 부분이 조금 궁금하거든요. 우리나라 뭐 이렇게 커피를 많이 마시게 되었을까? 뭐 강의 중에 여러 가지 설명을 하셨는데 그 중에 가장 영향을 좀 미쳤던 이렇게 커피가 붐을 이룬 데 역할을 했던 것이 가장 좀 중요한 팩터가 무엇인지 그게 좀 궁금합니다.
Could you first translate? I mean, just in English before the answer. Shortly.
Okay, so he asked a question very similar to yours, where he said, industrialization, the spread of individualism has happened in pretty much every country in the world. So that doesn't explain the quantity of coffee that Korean people drink. Like we drink so much coffee, there's so many coffee shops. Why was that a phenomenon unique to Korea? And I think it has something to do with the way Korean culture developed and the enormous influence of consumers, female consumers in their teens and 20s had on Korean popular culture. So I didn't get to that part of my speech, which I had prepared. But what happened in Korea was during the process of Korean industrialization, Koreans had some of the longest working hours in the world. And Korean people grew up until then in sort of like a extended family sort of setting, but they were moving into apartment. So imagine the ladies were having a very hard time because they weren't allowed to work yet, except for maybe being teachers and nurses. And their husbands are out working 150 hours often in a week. So, and they're cut off from their extended family, so they're very lonely, right? And they became an avid consumer of TV. So if you go to a countryside restaurant in Korea, you will see like a 70-year-old grandma who's chopping like green onion or something, and they'll always have some kind of TV program on. And I've come to believe that this was sort of like a replacement extended family for them, right? So they were sort of, they were lonely, they were stuck at home. The link between their extended family had been cut off, so they had this TV on, they related to people on the television, they sort of replaced their family in a way. So because of this phenomenon, if you look at what Korea does best in terms of cultural production is, whether it's K-pop or Korean TV shows, Korean culture appeals to a certain segment of the population in the world, and that's usually female audience between 16 and 25. And I think this is very important because Korea had some of the, while they had this traditional structure, they also had some of the highest education level for women of any country. Even today, 77% of Korean women go to college, as opposed to 70% of men. So actually, women are more educated on average than men in Korea. And because the family structure was still very traditional, they were the people who had to get away from, in a way, family more. And these girls usually gathered at coffee shops because it was usually, if you look at young men in Korea, they gather at Korean barbecue joints. But young women would usually gather in coffee shops because it was cleaner. They generally have like better facilities. It was in neighborhoods that were less of a security risk. So for these regions, I think the fact that these coffee shops have been a gathering place for female consumers in their teens and 20s, and the fact that these girls, the highly educated young women, had an outsized influence on Korean culture, has probably something to do with the fact that Korea slowly moved away from alcohol culture into coffee culture. So that's one factor I think that was contributing to it. So even Korean coffee shops, the way I describe it, how beautiful they are and how they are conceptual, they sort of contain this element of conceptual art in them. I think that has also something to do with this particular segment of the population. If you look at them, they're usually incredibly nice to take pictures of, and if you see, there's sort of like a network of teen girls all over Asia who share pictures of like Korean coffee shops because the design sort of is made in a way to appeal to this particular age group and this particular gender group. So I think one of the reasons of the rise of Korean coffee shops in the world is the fact that if you look at in Korea, TikTok videos and Instagram shorts, which is where most people get their information about coffee shops, the content is mainly generated by this particular group. And this particular group is what Korean coffee shop owners have always been focused on. So when, let's just say, a European tourist, 18-year-old high school girl, young lady, comes to Korea and see coffee shops, they're like, oh, I find coffee shops that specifically target my age group, my taste, and I love it. And I see this happening over and over with my European friends who sometimes come over to Korea. So I think that's one of the reasons that we see this happening.
Thank you. We're already 6 minutes over time. I think we could continue, but I think we have to stop here. Thank you so much for your X-ray structured picture of the young Korean culture and the coffee culture. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
감사합니다.
Thank you very much. From the last presentation, we could get a trace the long history of coffee in Korea. And also from two presentations, we could get an informative and very insightful presentation. Thank you. And to our moderator, please give another round of applause. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
So now we will have the coffee break. Yeah. So today's coffee has been prepared by Ayantu, so specialty Ethiopian coffee brand. So as your cup empties, the message will appear and sharing how each cup of coffee can make a difference in the lives of coffee farmers and their children and their families. So please enjoy the coffee break, and the next session will start at 3:50 p.m. Thank you. I will see you soon.